Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, and today is the 19th day, February 2023, and broadcasting with Discerning What is True channel. I am actually on YouTube and Odyssey tonight. So here we go. I'm dealing with a different type of subject tonight, so let's get into it. The title of my show is Inflation: The Jewish Defense, which was a book that was written by Eustace Mullins. In my 35 years as a practicing economist, one of my greatest difficulties has been convincing patriots that they must understand the problem of inflation, that is, the Jewish disease, if they are to prevail against the depreciations, I mean, against the depredations of the biological parasite. As the patriot Ezra Pound said to me some 30 years ago, inflation is robbery. This is still the shortest and best definition of inflation. It is, folks. We're experiencing for the last 3 years in this country major inflation is going on. Okay. Pound explained to me that many centuries ago, rulers discovered that the regimes could be in peril by any tampering with the value of their circulation medium of exchange of money, and therefore they imposed the death penalty on anyone who committed this offense. At that time, inflation meant the depreciation of gold or silver coins by clipping them. That is, trimming a minute amount of precious metal from the rims so they could hardly be detected. In modern times, inflation means tampering with the value of a paper certificate which circulates and are accepted as money. A person with inside knowledge of such tampering could borrow $1 million, knowing that inflation would allow him to increase the value of his borrowing or perhaps to $10 million, or at the same time reduce his debt to about $100,000. As I pointed out in the Federal Reserve conspiracy, the Jews won this power to alter the value of the American dollar at their pleasure. First, by consolidating the money and credit of the people of the United States in a central bank called the Federal Reserve Bank, and then by setting up the mechanism, the Open Market Committee, to raise or lower the purchasing power of the dollar whenever they wish. Their mechanism were worked out by Paul Warburg, that is the partner of the International Jewish Bankers House of the Kuhn, Lowe and Company of New York, and the American representative of the Rothschild interests, and were enacted into law by Congress in 1913. Against the bitter protests of such American patriots as Congressional Charles Lindbergh. Yes, that's Charles Lindbergh, the father of Charles Lindbergh Jr., who flew in the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic Ocean by himself. The Federal Reserve Act was engineered through Congress by Virginia Carter Glass and signed into law by Virginian Woodrow Wilson, two supposedly Southerners, you see. Although few Americans realized at the time, this consolidation of our money and credit placed our destiny in the hands of the cruel and with the Jews, with the result that we have endured 2 world wars, a Great Depression, 3 of the worst tragedies to befall our nation, and are now being plunged into another Great Depression through deliberate inflation of our currency, which will give the Jews a profit of $1 trillion, which will forever enslave our children to the Jews. Thomas Jefferson warned against such consolidation, June 15, 1821, quoted in the Richmond Enquirer. Our government is now taking so steadily a course as to show by what roads it will pass to destruction, to wit, by consolidation and then corruption, its necessary consequence. The perils of becoming eternally indebted to the Jews by their manipulation of our monetary system was a subject of the earliest documents of our legal system, such as the Magna Carta, the basis of English common law, which subsequently became the basis of our Constitution. Section 10 of the Magna Carta states, if anyone who has borrowed a sum of money from the Jews dies before the debt has been repaid, his heirs shall pay no interest on the debt for as long as he remains under age, irrespective to whom he holds his lands. Thus, Magna Carta, a basic document of our freedoms, which has traditionally been presented to us as the protest of the people against cruel aristocrats or overlords, is now seen to have been a protest against the exploitation of the people by the Jews. When a property holder died, a Jew would appear and would announce to the heirs that he had held a note against the property. If this widow and children could not pay the Jews' demand, he would then seize the property and evict them. It was this situation which gave rise to the Magna Carta. Section 11 of the Magna Carta says, if a man dies owing money to Jews, his wife may have her dowry and pay nothing towards the debt from it. But protests from Simple Simon, why shouldn't a legal agreement such as the Magna Carta make a provision about legal legal debts? Because Mrs. SS, that is Simple Simon, the Magna Carta does not make any mention of debts owed to non-Jews, especially experience having proven that non-Jewish claims against a state could be settled without hardship to the heirs. But it was necessary for the people to meet and to demand they be relieved from paying a pound of flesh to the Jews who appeared as soon as any property holder died and demanded immediate payment. That's why the movie, if I can remember, William Shakespeare, he did do a movie, did a play, and it's dealing with Venice. And I can't think of the name of it right now, folks. Let me see if I can get to it real quick here. Yes, The Merchant of Venice is what it was called, from William Shakespeare. If you can watch that movie, it'd be good to see it, especially the most recent one. Kind of gives you an idea what he's talking about in this particular script here. I think that when he says that they asked for a pound of flesh, that's serious, folks. And that's what that movie's about. Not movie, but play. Well, it's a movie also, but it's a play also. So let's get back to this show here, about the reading, I should say. To understand what the Jews have in store for the American people, let us first look at our circulation medium, the paper currency of the Federal Reserve System. I was the first economist to point out that when the Federal Reserve System began issuing paper dollars whose only backing was paper bonds, what we were witnessing was the greatest counterfeit gang in the history of the world. Few Americans realize that they do have the privilege of printing and issuing their own money and circulation of it. The counterfeiting law simply forbid U.S. citizens to want facsimiles or counterfeits of the Federal Reserve notes, which are themselves counterfeit. Those counterfeiters, of course, have one important basis for the worldwide success of their counterfeiting operation. Their counterfeits are backed by the faith and credit of the people of the United States. As Mayor Amschel Rothschild said, give me the power to issue our nation's money, and I do not care who makes the laws. And that's what they got. The Rothschilds' emissary, Paul Warburg, devised our present currency system, not merely to gain control of a monetary issue, but also to enslave the people with that very currency by issuing it as an interest-bearing debt. As a result, we are now held hostage to our own paper dollars, a total debt of $4 trillion at that time, $120 billion issued by the Federal Reserve System. Yet our money supply is only $401 billion, means that we could never pay it off. That is the principal of this debt. We can only make annual payments on interest, about $100 billion a year. And the printing of more paper dollars to fund this interest payment is the principal cause of our present inflation. Because of the tremendous power afforded by the international Jewish bankers through their control of our money supply, the Federal Reserve notes are now merely an occupational currency, which is distributed to the inhabitants of a military occupied nation to allow them to transact their daily business. But currency is tightly controlled by the occupying power, cannot be used by the slave workers to arm or to free themselves. Thus, a situation is developing in the United States very similar to that in communist occupied Poland, in which the oppressed and bitter slave workers are increasingly willing to face the guns of occupying police and military forces in order to gain some slight respite from their grim struggle for daily survival. The rapidly rising prices of slave workers' daily subsistence spurs them to risk every greater perils in their desire for freedom. Money, the circulating medium, is the bloodstream of the economy, carrying nourishment to every outlining limb and lower organ of the body politic. To control the host, the biological parasite, the Jews, knows that he must gain control of this circulating medium, the monetary unit. With the aid of the poet Ezra Pound, which very few people know who he is, who was denied any, what I would call any Nobel Prize for his poetry, simply brilliant poet, who was then serving as an indeterminate sentence as a political prisoner held in a madhouse. I documented the actual means through which the Jews gained control of the money and credit of the American people through the passage of the Federal Reserve Act on December 23rd, 1913. They did it at night, folks. They did it during the recess. These scoundrels did it at night and during the Christmas recess in 1913. And Colonel Mandel House got the first look of it after they passed it, before even Woodrow Wilson got a chance to look at it, which will tell you who Colonel Colonel Mandel House was at that time. So determined was the opposition of many American patriots to this act of treason, including Congressman Charles Lindbergh, that the Jews were able to attain passage of the Federal Reserve Act only through a subterfuge, after many congressmen had already left the city for the annual Christmas recess, including many of those who had sworn to defeat this bill and to protect the American people from its ravages. In an act of revenge against Lindbergh, who was subsequently defeated for re-election after federal agents, including young J. Edward Hoover, raided his home and burned his books, his grandson was hideously killed in an act of ritual murder. And this murder was then used to instigate a hate crime or campaign against the German people by false testimony that a German immigrant, one Gerhard Hoffmann, had been guilty of this crime. Now this is we're going to talk about this later on. This particular deal, he just gets into it just here briefly, but it's amazing what these people will do. Let's continue. Without the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, which Ezra Pound quoted the then Congressman Cordell Hull as saying, "We got it passed in the nick of time," meaning just before the outbreak of World War I. This tragic war would have ended in 1916, and indeed might never have begun. No, it would never have taken place, folks. It would never have taken place because all the countries in Europe were broke. They were all broke. So the United States provided fresh money, so to speak, to these countries. And that's what happened. That's also what happened in World War II also. And that's also what happened in the Great Depression, to also steal more of what the Americans had. Our congressmen today are unaware or they don't want to deal with it. Most of them are bought, you see. Let's continue. The nations of Europe have exhausted their budgets in huge outlays for military buildup since the War of 1870 between Germany and France, with the result that they did not have the cash reserves to embark or fight a major war. Only by mustering the money and credit of the American people through the Federal Reserve Act were the Jews able to herd the Gentile cattle out for this profitable slaughter, even when the loans from American bankers to European powers found themselves bankrupt by 1916. It was recently revealed that early in 1916, the Kaiser government informally notified the British government that the German nation was now bankrupt and could not continue the war. The purpose of this overture was to initiate terms of peace so that the Germans could withdraw from the war on as favorable terms as possible. To their amazement, the Germans were informed that they would be given sufficient supplies to enable them to continue fighting. You hear that? You hear that? And that was through the Belgians. I read. The Rothschilds had Herbert Hoover left, who until then had been an obscure promoter of mining stocks, organized the Belgian War Relief, which, to much to the astonishment of the Belgians, who had just had one of their best crop years in history, the relief, of course, was never intended for the Belgians, but was landed in Belgium. And shipped straight across the county, that is, to the Germans in order to keep World War I going for another 2 years. Enormous amount of food, coal, and other military necessities were delivered to the Germans by Hoover and the Rothschilds, all contributed by the American people under the misconception that they were saving the starving Belgians from disaster. You never were told that in history, folks. Most of what I'm sharing with you is not in history, folks. They don't share this. They don't tell you this. Hoover's part in the conspiracy won him worldwide acclaim from the International Jewish Clique as the great engineer, a welcome change from his previous appellation as the great con man, due to his successful promotion of worthless mining shares to the extent that he had become one of the few persons who was ever barred from the London Stock Exchange. His unacceptable history was finally exposed by Samuel Roth, who published the book called The Strange Career of Mr. Hoover by John Hamill, Hamill, better known for his work called Jews Must Live. Roth's book on Hoover brought him the unwelcome attention of government agencies, and in a transparent setup, a messenger brought a large envelope to his office, laid it down, and roughly left. Detectives then rushed into the office, seized the envelope, which contained horrific examples of pornography, and charged Roth with its possession and distribution. The United States versus Roth subsequently became the textbook case on prosecution for pornography, solely because Roth had exposed the Hoover myth. You get a drink of water here. A devoted and hardworking British nurse in Belgium named Edith Cavell, Cavell, was horrified to learn that the Belgian war relief was delivering vast stores of military supplies to the German army. She immediately notified the British military intelligence of her discovery, as any loyal British woman would have done. British military intelligence was dismayed by Edith Cavell's information, but not because it was a surprise to them, as it was not, but because it placed them in a difficult position of having to silence her. They decided to accomplish this by notifying the German military intelligence that they must immediately arrest and execute Edith Cavell as a spy. This is true, folks. Please listen. The German officers balked at this, knowing that Edith Cavell had achieved a reputation as a selfless, hard-working nurse who has saved many German soldiers' lives by her devoted care, and that such an execution would be publicized as another example of German brutality. But the British officers insist on her execution. Otherwise, the war might not continue. The Germans then arrested and shot Edith Cavell as a spy. She was elevated to the status of a martyr by a worldwide campaign of propaganda whose aim was not to confer upon her external fame, but to conceal the true facts behind her execution, which had taken place at the insistence of her own government, in order to silence her and to prolong World War I, for that crucial moment when the United States could be dragged into it. You heard that. And I believe that James Rollins Reese would be a part of that, the Tavistock Institute. I believe that's would be a part of who that is. I'm guessing, but that's who this is. This is already the time that the Tavistock Institute is involved. The execution of Edith Cavell and the subsequent elevation of Herbert Hoover to international fame some years later, the presidency of the United States, both events which took place solely to prolong World War I for 2 more years and to cause the deaths of many millions of people and to spread misery and famine across Europe as a necessity peculiar to the installation of communist governments, also had great consequences on the subject of this paper called inflation. Because Germany was already bankrupt in 1916, her continuance of the war for another 2 years, even with America's aid, merely prolonged the day of reckoning. The Versailles Peace Conference, which has been called one of the greatest gatherings of Jews in modern history, set the stage for the biological parasite greatest winning, the German mark inflation. Eisenberger and the other Jews who represented Germany at the peace conference agreed to a ruinous demand from the Jews who represent the Allied powers that Germans should pay huge sums of reparations for having engaged in the war. Of course, nothing was said at this peace conference about the fact that it was the Jews who had set up the war too, and that it was the Jews who in 1916, when it seemed that their war had run out of gas, set up a plan to keep it going for another 2 years. Certainly, Germany's war guilt, if it had ever existed, would have been ameliorated by the circumstances. No British or American officers were ever accused of war guilt for having kept World War I going for an additional 2 years. The German, or rather Jewish representatives of Germany at the Paris Peace Conference agreed to Allied demands that they paid these huge sums in reparations, even though they knew that Germany was already bankrupt. However, there was a reason for their seemingly inconsistency. A horde of Galician Jews were pouring defeated and prostitution from Poland and other sections of the Pale each of them carrying a tiny nest egg in gold and jewels. These treasures, although sufficient to buy the Jewish invaders a comfortable home or business, might suddenly be transformed into an enormous bargaining power if by some stroke of fortune the German mark, which had long been one of Europe's most stable currencies, would suddenly be depreciated through inflation. But how does one suddenly inflate a currency? By printing much greater amount of paper money than they are normally required to carry on a daily transaction. Just the same thing is happening in this country right now, folks. You have eyes to hear. You have eyes to see. You have ears to hear. Your country is being destroyed right before your eyes, folks. By printing much greater amount of paper money than are normally required to carry on daily transactions, the Jews would inform their fellow officials in Germany that they could escape the ruinous assessment of reparation by suddenly inflating the currency and by paying the reparations payments in inflated marks. That's what we've been doing here, folks, in America. Consequently, for the outset of the war until 1923, the German government issued additional 92.8 quintillion paper marks. Paper marks, a 245 billion fold increase in the money supply. Prices rose 1.38 trillion fold, and interest rates went to 10,000% per year. Overnight, the Galatian Jews became multi-millionaires in Germany. Instead of buying a small tailor shop with their little hoard of gold or jewels, they could open a large department store in Berlin. The German middle class sold their priceless heirlooms and their homes to the Jews for the price of a loaf of bread. The inevitable reaction of the German people was a patriotic movement to prevent their further exploitation by the Jews, who, because of their newly created wealth, now controlled the news media, the government, and the courts. Does this sound familiar? Does Germany 1924 seem suspicious like the United States? That was, he says, in 1981. We too have been busily creating a little refugee paradise in the United States in which a small hoard of gold or other precious items suddenly is transformed into enormous wealth. How did this happen? Once again, the government embarked upon a deliberate program of reducing its debts by printing enormous sums of extra paper money, as much as $6 or $8 billion per week. Ostensibly, this was done as a result of the sudden increase in the price of oil by the Arab countries. However, as we shall see, the Arabs had very little say in the matter themselves. It has recently been revealed that in 1973, our so-called Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, a German Jew, conspired with or forced the Shah of Iran to inaugurate this huge price increase of oil. Not the least of the interesting items of this agreement was a pledge by the Shah to guarantee a supply of oil to the State of Israel. The Shah was then removed from the scene, you see, but Henry Kissinger is still prominent as an advisor to American officials. We need hardly be reminded that Kissinger's family was among those German Jews who profited so greatly from the German mark inflation of 1923. When the reluctant Arab countries had been persuaded by Kissinger to agree to a huge increase in the price of oil, the Jews then informed our government that by inflating the currency, they would still be paying the earlier price for oil, while the Arabs would believe that they were getting a great increase. Obviously, Jews did not wish to dwell on the fact that the great increase in paper money or interest-bearing debt would give them a stranglehold on the American people, and that not even our great-grandchildren would be able to pay such a debt. Since the Jews already had vast holdings in American stocks, bonds, real estate, gold, and jewels, inflation would increase their wealth many times, and at the same time give them absolute economic power over the middle class and the workers who have no such holdings, and where income was measured solely by the inflated paper dollars, based upon Germany in 1923 and the United States in 1980. To consolidate their power over American workers, the Jews now propose to control the runaway inflation, which they themselves had created by raising interest rates to unheard of heights. Yeah, I remember those years. Sure do. A formula for controlling such inflation has been devised called the monetarist or quantitative theory of money, which proposes controlling inflation by raising interest rates. This monetarist was none other than one known as Milton Friedman, a Jewish professor of economics at Rockefeller's University of Chicago. To implement these fantastic interest rates, the Jews elevated to the President of the United States a rigorous provincial boob named Jimmy Carter, which with this simpleton at the helm, the Jews quickly ran the interest rates up to 20%, while Carter piously denounced the heirs for causing our inflation. The heirs couldn't have done that, folks, in a million years. At the election of Jimmy Carter in '76, I predicted that we would have 25% inflation. I failed to foresee that the Jews better achieve their profits by raising the interest rates to 25%. Carter, a born-again Christian, was surrounded by Jews who implemented the monetary policies to suit their aims. A gaggle of Blumenthals, Kants, Solomons, and Eisenstein. Because 7% of the American economy depends directly upon the sales of automotive products, and another 20% is indirectly involved in such sales, the higher oil prices wreaked havoc on the American people. The wives had already been put to work. Now the children had to seek jobs to keep food on the table. Families were split, asunder by the terrible economic pressures. The Jewish-controlled banks foreclosed on more and more homes and businesses, while from another direction, the Internal Revenue Service, also known here as the Israeli Revenue Service, viciously attacked the people, demanding that they pay their ruinous tax based on the rate of inflation, even though the Tax Foundation recently reported that American workers had had no increase in real income for more than 10 years. But at the same time, direct federal income taxes have more than doubled, and Social Security taxes have more than tripled. In this atmosphere of economic disaster and national tragedy, the Georgia fools solemnly informed the American people that they must overcome their national malaise and they must bite the bullet. The response was to overwhelmingly vote him out of office. However, since Carter was not the architect of the disaster, but was merely a typical Shabbos goat wretch hired by the Jews as a front for their satanic operations, his disappearance is unlikely to alleviate our difficulties. Is it possible to live with inflation? We can see this in the present historical nest of the Jews, the bandit state of Israel, where inflation is now a staggering 180%. However, we quote from Foreign Affairs Summer 1979, pages, that is 1010, a leading Israeli banker, Ephraim Rainier, said the public here doesn't pay the price of inflation. The United States and the Jewish people around the world do that. This amazing admission proves that the present American economic system is designed by and operated for the benefit of the Jews. They are also profiting by enormous technological advances in computers and communication, because these advances have enabled their manipulation of inflationary forces to operate at an incredible modern speed, far removed from the clumsy signaling devices which the Rothschilds used against the Battle of Waterloo to impoverish the British and seize the government of England. In Harper's Magazine, February 1980, L.J. Davis writes, the faster a banker moves money, even in the form of numbers, the more inflation he causes. In effect, he devalues the currency, penalizes depositors, give his borrowers a windfall. Davis goes on to point out that the 113 American banks had foreign assets in 1965 of only $9 billion. By 1978, 627 foreign branch offices of American banks had $306 billion in assets. Not only did this amount grow astronomically, but these American banks were making most of their profits on their foreign operators. In 1976, Citicorp 54% of its earnings in foreign transactions. This was identical situation was allowed to develop in the 1920s when stock prices were greatly inflated and much of the process was siphoned off into shaky foreign loans, principally to banana republics in Latin America. Today, the loans are to equally shaky black dictatorships in Africa. When a non-Jew, Benjamin Strong, head of the Federal Reserve, Bank of New York, tried to warn his fellow bankers of the dangerous situation which was developing in 1927. He went to Europe to urge the other central banks to take preventative measures and to halt the inflation. Although he's an exceptional healthy man, he had a heart attack on the boat during the voyage. The crash in 1929 went off his plan. So this guy went there trying to warn them, and he somehow had a heart attack on the ship. Today, we are in a much more dangerous situation. L.J. Davis warns that the entire domestic money supply of the 7th largest industrial countries is $2.7 trillion, and almost a third of the world available money is now floating around between a few of the world's largest banks. The indication of a world catastrophe are inescapable. That was the 1980s, folks. We must ask ourselves, what will we do when this occurs? Jews are already making their plans. They know that when this happened in Germany, the German people responded by electing a government which promised to free them from Jewish economic domination and exploitation. They're desperately trying to avoid this development here by having government agencies such as the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, and the BATF arrest and imprison anyone who has spoken against the Jewish crimes. The IRS has special hit lists, you see, drawn up by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, all those American patriots who have opposed Jewish exploitation of the American people. For years, the FBI has directed most of its budget to harass patriotic groups, while the Mafia and the Communist Party operate in the United States without restriction. We, in turn, must have our list of the Zionist collaborations in the government. Those traitors must pay the full penalty for their crimes against the people. The harshest measure must be applied to these jackals of the media who have acted as vehicles for the worst of the Jewish crimes. We patriots need not fear that we will be in more danger in the future than we have endured in the past. The tide is turning. It is the enemies of America who are now in peril. So that's a short-lived deal, what I would call from Jewish Disease by Eustace Mullins. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you hearing me out. So I just want to share that with you. And thank you for being here. Wish you a good night. You take care.